The Watcher in the Corn. I've seen a lot of strange things in my years of farming, but nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered in my cornfield that summer. It started with a feeling, just a nagging sense that something wasn't right. But by the time I understood what was happening, it was already too late. The morning dew still clung to the corn stalks as I made my way through the field, my boots leaving dark impressions in the soft earth. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. It was my favorite time of day, the quiet before the world fully woke up. I breathed in deeply, savoring the earthy scent of my crop. This year's harvest was looking promising, the corn stalks standing tall and proud. But as I rounded a bend in the path, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the middle of my perfect rows of corn, was a large circular area where the stalks had been completely flattened. I blinked hard, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the scene remained unchanged. Hesitantly, I stepped closer to investigate. The corn lay in a spiraling pattern, as if a giant had reached down from the sky and swirled it with their finger. I knelt down, running my hand over the bent stalks. They weren't broken or damaged, just pressed down. What in the world? I muttered to myself, standing up and surveying the area. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. At the very center of the circle was a small mound of freshly turned earth. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. Using a nearby stick, I poked at the mound. The soil gave way easily, revealing something pale beneath. I leaned in closer, squinting to make out what it was. A bone, a human finger bone to be exact. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Not on my farm, not in my field. I needed to call the police, to report this. But as I turned to head back to the house, something caught my eye. In the distance, just barely visible above the corn, was a figure. It was only there for a split second before disappearing, but I could have sworn I saw someone watching me. My hands shook as I dialed 911, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. They assured me they'd send someone out right away, but warned me not to touch anything further. The wait for the police felt like an eternity. I paced back and forth at the edge of the field, my eyes constantly scanning the corn for any sign of movement. But everything remained still and quiet. When the officers finally arrived, I led them to the circle. They seemed just as baffled as I was, taking photos and measurements. They dug up the bone and a few others they found nearby, bagging them as evidence. "Mr. Thompson," one of the officers said, his face grim, "we're going to need to cordon off this area for further investigation. I'm afraid your harvest might be delayed." I nodded numbly, still trying to process everything. As they worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of the corn made me jump. That night I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing in my field. Who were they? What did they want? The next morning, I was up before dawn. I knew I shouldn't interfere with the investigation, but I couldn't just sit around waiting. I needed answers. I decided to set up some trail cameras around the field. If anyone was out there, I was going to catch them. Days passed with no new developments. The police continued their investigation, but they seemed to be at a loss. No missing persons reports matched the limited remains they'd found. It was as if the bones had appeared out of thin air. Every evening I checked the cameras, my heart in my throat, but they never showed anything out of the ordinary. Just corn swaying in the breeze and the occasional curious deer. Until the fifth night. I was scrolling through the footage, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, when something made me sit up straight. There, in the corner of one frame, was a shadowy figure moving through the corn. My fingers fumbled with the controls as I rewound and paused the video. The image was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. Someone had been in my field. I fast-forwarded, watching as the figure moved with unnatural speed through the corn. They seemed to be digging. My stomach churned as I realized they were in the same spot where we'd found the bones. The timestamp on the video showed this had happened just a few hours ago. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and shotgun, heading out into the night. The corn whispered around me as I made my way to the site. The police tape fluttered in the breeze, an eerie reminder of what we'd found. I swept my flashlight beam across the area, my pulse racing. The mound of earth was there again, freshly disturbed. I approached it slowly, my shotgun at the ready. Using the barrel, I gently prodded at the soil. Something gleamed in the flashlight's beam. I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat. It was a necklace, half buried in the dirt. As I reached out to touch it, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight illuminating a figure standing just a few feet away. They were tall, unnaturally so, their form obscured by what looked like a long, tattered cloak. But what struck me most were their eyes, glowing an eerie blue in the darkness. I raised my shotgun, my voice shaking as I shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure tilted its head, regarding me with those unnatural eyes. When it spoke, its voice was like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "We are the Watchers," it said. "We have always been here." "What does that mean?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you kill that person? The one these bones belong to?" The figure shook its head slowly. "We do not kill, we watch, we remember, we protect." "Protect what?" It raised a long, spindly arm, gesturing to the cornfield around us. "This land holds many secrets, many memories. We keep them safe." I felt a chill run down my spine. The bones, the necklace, their memories. The figure nodded. "From long ago, before your time, before this field was yours." My mind was reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sort of elaborate hoax, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized the implications of what this being was saying. "How long have you been here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Always," it replied simply. "We were here when the first seed was planted. We will be here long after the last stalk falls." I lowered my shotgun slightly, my curiosity overcoming my fear. "Why show yourselves now? Why leave the bones for me to find?" The figure seemed to sigh, a sound like wind through hollow reeds. "The land is changing. New dangers approach. We needed to wake the memories to prepare. Prepare for what?" But even as I asked the question, the figure began to fade, becoming transparent until it disappeared entirely. I was left standing alone in the dark, the corn rustling around me. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream. But the necklace in my pocket and the footage on my cameras told a different story. The police eventually closed their investigation, chalking it up to an unsolved mystery. I never told anyone what I saw that night. Who would believe me? But I knew I wasn't crazy. Something ancient and powerful was watching over my land, guarding secrets I could barely comprehend. As the harvest season approached, I found myself spending more time in the field. Sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch glimpses of tall, cloaked figures moving between the rows of corn, but they never showed themselves fully again. The circle where I'd first found the bones gradually filled in, new corn growing to replace what had been flattened. To anyone else, it looked like nothing had ever happened there. But I knew better. Every night, as I looked out over my field bathed in moonlight, I'd whisper a quiet thank you to the Watchers. I didn't fully understand their purpose or their nature, but I knew they were there, silent guardians of the land and its memories. And as I worked my farm, tending to the crops that had been in my family for generations, I couldn't help but wonder how many other secrets were buried in the soil beneath my feet. How many other Watchers stood silent vigil over fields across the world? One thing was certain: I would never look at my cornfield the same way again. Every rustle of the wind through the stalks, every shadow cast by the setting sun held new meaning. I was no longer just a farmer tending his crop. I was a keeper of secrets, a guardian of memories, forever changed by the Watchers in the corn. Lost in the stalks. I never thought I'd fear the sound of rustling corn, but here I am, heart pounding, straining my ears for any sign of pursuit as the sun dips below the horizon. What started as a shortcut home has become a nightmare I'm not sure I'll escape. It was Jake's idea to cut through Old Man Henderson's cornfield. We'd been at the creek all afternoon, skipping rocks and talking about our plans for senior year. By the time we realized how late it was getting, the sun was already low in the sky, painting everything golden. "Come on," Jake said, nodding towards the vast expanse of corn stretching out before us. "If we go through here, we'll save at least 20 minutes. I hesitated, eyeing the dense stalks warily. "I don't know, man. Henderson's pretty serious about trespassers." Jake rolled his eyes. "He's like 100 years old. What's he gonna do, chase us with his walker?" I laughed, pushing aside my unease. "All right, fine. But if we get caught, I'm blaming you." We plunged into the field, the corn stalks immediately closing in around us. The leaves brushed against my arms, making me shiver despite the warm evening air. The rows seemed to stretch on forever, an endless sea of green. At first we kept up a steady pace, joking and shoving each other as we went. But as the light began to fade, our laughter died away, replaced by an uneasy silence. "Hey, Jake," I called out, pushing aside a particularly thick bunch of stalks. "You sure we're going the right way?" There was no answer. I stopped, a chill running down my spine. "Jake, this isn't funny, man." Silence. Panic started to set in as I spun around, trying to get my bearings. Every direction looked the same, just more corn, stretching out as far as I could see. "Jake!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Where are you?" A rustling sound came from behind me, and I whirled around, heart racing. But it was just the wind stirring the leaves. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Okay, think. We came in from the west, so if I just keep heading east, I should eventually reach the road. Simple, right? Except I had no idea which way was east anymore. The sky was darkening rapidly now, the golden hour giving way to deep purple twilight. I fumbled for my phone, cursing when I saw there was no signal. Of course not. We were in the middle of nowhere. I turned on the flashlight function, the beam cutting through the growing darkness. It didn't help much. The light just created more shadows, making the corn seem to loom even larger around me. That's when I heard it. Footsteps somewhere behind me, heavy and deliberate. "Jake," I called out, hope and fear warring in my voice. "Is that you?" No response, just more footsteps, getting closer. I started moving, no longer caring about direction. I just needed to get away from whoever or whatever was following me. The corn whipped at my face as I ran, leaves slicing my cheeks. My breath came in ragged gasps, panic overriding everything else. The footsteps kept pace, never falling behind. I burst into a small clearing, moonlight filtering down through a break in the corn. For a moment, I thought I was saved. Surely this meant I was near the edge of the field. But as I spun around, I realized with growing horror that I was simply in the eye of the storm. Corn surrounded me on all sides, the stalks swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves. Then, a voice, low and gravelly, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't be here, boy." I stumbled backward, nearly falling. "Who's there? Show yourself." A chuckle, dark and humorless. "Oh, I think it's better if I don't." The corn in front of me parted, and a figure stepped into the clearing. In the dim moonlight, I could make out the shape of a man, tall and lean, with something long and sharp glinting in his hand. "You see," the figure continued, taking a step closer, "this field doesn't take kindly to trespassers." I backed away, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. This kind of thing didn't happen in real life, only in horror movies and campfire stories. "Look, I'm sorry," I stammered. "We didn't mean any harm. We were just taking a shortcut." The figure tilted its head. A chill ran through me as I remembered Jake. Where was he? Had this thing already found him? "My friend," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He was with me, but we got separated." The figure was silent for a long moment. Then it raised the object in its hand, a scythe, I realized with growing terror. "Your friend is gone," it said simply. "And soon you will be too." I didn't think. I just ran. I plunged back into the corn, no longer caring about the cuts and scratches. Behind me, I could hear the figure giving chase. the scythe whistling as it cut through the air. Tears streamed down my face as I ran, blinding me. This couldn't be real. Any moment now, I'd wake up in my bed, safe and sound. But the pain in my lungs and the sting of my cuts told me this was all too real. I burst out of the cornfield so suddenly I nearly fell. The road stretched out before me, blessedly empty. Without looking back, I sprinted towards town, not stopping until the lights of Main Street came into view. As I collapsed on a bench, gasping for air, I fumbled for my phone again. This time, mercifully, I had signal. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police cars, search parties, questions I could barely answer. They found Jake wandering along the edge of the field, dazed and confused, but otherwise unharmed. He had no memory of what happened after we got separated. As for me, I told them everything, the figure, the chase, the scythe. They listened politely, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They searched the field but found nothing out of the ordinary. No mysterious figure, no weapon, not even any sign of our passage through the corn. Probably just got spooked in the dark, one officer said kindly. It happens. The mind can play tricks on you. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. It's been weeks now and I still can't sleep through the night. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that field, running for my life. The sound of rustling corn makes me break out in a cold sweat. Jake thinks I'm crazy. He's convinced we just got lost and let our imaginations run wild. Maybe he's right. Maybe it was all just a terror-induced hallucination. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear that gravelly voice whispering through the trees. You shouldn't be here, boy. And I know deep in my bones that something is out there, waiting, watching. And if I ever set foot in that cornfield again, I won't be coming back out. So take my advice. Stick to the roads, no matter how long it takes. Because sometimes the shortcut isn't worth the price you might have to pay. And whatever you do, stay out of the corn after dark. You never know what might be waiting for you there. The Watcher in the Field. I used to love driving at night. The empty roads, the stillness, the stars overhead, it was peaceful. But now, every time I get behind the wheel after sunset, my palms sweat and my heart races. Because I know what can be hiding in the darkness, waiting and watching. It was just past midnight when my car started making a strange rattling noise. I was on my way home from a late shift at the diner, tired and ready for bed. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Come on, not now, I muttered, glancing at the temperature gauge. It was creeping into the red zone. I eased off the gas, scanning the roadside for a safe place to pull over. That's when I saw it, a small gravel turnout next to a vast cornfield. The stalks swayed gently in the night breeze, looking almost silver in the moonlight. Sighing, I guided my old Civic onto the gravel, wincing at the crunch beneath the tires. As soon as I cut the engine, silence descended, broken only by the ticking of the cooling motor. I reached for my phone, already dreading the conversation with my roommate. No signal. Of course. Perfect, I groaned, letting my head fall back against the headrest. That's when I saw it. Just a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I turned, peering out into the cornfield. There, standing perfectly still among the stalks, was a figure. My breath caught in my throat. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see the outline clearly, tall and unnaturally thin, its arms hanging limp at its sides. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things. When I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. Get it together, Sarah, I muttered to myself, shaking my head. You're tired, that's all. I tried to focus on the problem at hand. The car, right. I popped the hood and got out, shivering as the cool night air hit my skin. The cornfield loomed beside me, a wall of darkness. As I leaned over the engine, trying to remember anything useful from my high school auto shop class, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, that sensation of being watched. Slowly, I turned back towards the field. The figure was there again, closer this time, close enough that I could see it was unnaturally tall, its head nearly level with the top of the corn stalks. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. This couldn't be real. I had to be hallucinating. I slammed the hood shut and dove back into the car, locking the doors. My hands shook as I tried the ignition. The engine sputtered, but didn't catch. Come on, I pleaded, pumping the gas pedal. I glanced up, my eyes drawn irresistibly to the cornfield. The figure was gone again. Relief flooded through me, followed quickly by doubt. Had I imagined the whole thing? I forced myself to take a deep breath. Okay, think logically. I was alone on a dark road, my car wouldn't start, and I had no cell signal. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to stay calm and figure out a plan. I tried the ignition again, but the engine just wheezed pathetically. Damn it! I slammed my hands against the steering wheel in frustration. That's when I heard it, a soft, rustling sound, like something moving through the corn. Slowly, dreading what I might see, I raised my eyes to the rearview mirror. The figure was standing directly behind my car. A scream caught in my throat. I could see it more clearly now in the reflection of my taillights. It was impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long and jointed in all the wrong places. Its face, if you could call it that, was a blank, featureless expanse of pale skin. As I watched, frozen in horror, it took a step closer to the car, then another. I lunged for the locks again, making sure every door was secured. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I searched desperately for something, anything I could use as a weapon. A soft tapping sound made me freeze. It was coming from the rear windshield. I didn't want to look. Every fiber of my being screamed at me not to turn around, but I couldn't help myself. I turned ever so slowly to face the back of the car. The creature was pressed against the glass, its blank face mere inches from mine. As I watched, it raised one impossibly long finger and tapped again on the window. A whimper escaped my lips. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't exist in the real world. The tapping continued, growing more insistent. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that when I opened them, it would all be gone. The sound stopped. Cautiously, I cracked one eye open. The rear windshield was empty. Relief washed over me, so intense it made me dizzy. It had just been my imagination after all. The stress of the breakdown, the lateness of the hour, my mind had conjured up a boogeyman to match my fears. I laughed shakily, running a hand through my hair. "Get it together, Sarah," I muttered. "You're losing it." I turned back to the front, ready to try the ignition one more time, and found myself face to face with the creature. It was right outside my driver's side window, its blank face pressed against the glass. I could see my own terrified reflection in the smooth, featureless expanse where its eyes should have been. A scream tore from my throat as I scrambled across to the passenger seat, putting as much distance between myself and the thing as possible. It didn't move, just stood there watching me, waiting. Suddenly the car felt very small. The locks seemed flimsy, the windows too thin. I was trapped in a metal box with a monster just outside. Minutes ticked by, though they felt like hours. The creature didn't move, didn't try to break in. It just watched. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling and waiting for something to happen. My eyes burned from staring, afraid to blink in case it moved. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The creature's blank face was changing. A seam appeared where a mouth should be, slowly widening into a grin that was far too wide, filled with too many teeth. I squeezed my eyes shut, unable to look anymore. This was it. This was how I died, alone on a deserted road, at the hands of something that shouldn't exist. A loud knock on the window made me jump, a scream catching in my throat. "Miss, are you all right?" My eyes flew open. Daylight streamed through the windows, and there, peering in at me with a concerned expression, was a police officer. I looked around wildly. The cornfield was just a cornfield, golden in the morning light. There was no sign of the creature. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door and practically fell out of the car. "Easy there," the officer said, steadying me. "Are you hurt? How long have you been out here?" I opened my mouth to explain, but where could I even begin? How could I describe what I'd seen without sounding completely insane? In the end, I just shook my head. "Car trouble," I managed to croak out. "I got stranded last night." The officer nodded sympathetically. "Let's take a look at that engine, shall we? And then we'll get you somewhere safe." As he leaned over my car, I found my gaze drawn back to the cornfield. In the cheerful morning sunlight, it was hard to believe what I'd experienced. Maybe it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. Maybe I'd fallen asleep and had an incredibly vivid nightmare. But then I saw it. Just for a second, a flicker of movement deep in the corn, a flash of something pale and wrong. "Miss T," the officer was looking at me strangely. "Are you sure you're all right?" I tore my eyes away from the field, forcing a smile. "Yeah," I lied. "I'm fine. Just tired." He didn't look convinced, but didn't press the issue. As we waited for the tow truck, I kept my back to the cornfield, ignoring the prickling sensation between my shoulder blades. I know what I saw that night. I know it was real, no matter how impossible it seems in the light of day. And I know that it's still out there, watching and waiting. So take my advice. If you're driving late at night and your car starts to act up, keep going. Drive on the rim if you have to. Because sometimes, the thing waiting for you in the darkness is far worse than anything you can imagine. And whatever you do, don't look too closely at the cornfields. You never know what might be looking back. The Dare. I've always been a skeptic. Ghosts, monsters, things that go bump in the night, I never believed in any of it. But after what happened in Miller's cornfield, I'm not so sure anymore. Some things can't be explained away by logic, and some dares should never be taken. It was supposed to be a night of harmless fun, a way to cap off our senior year before we all went our separate ways for college. 5 of us, me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Lily, and our friends Mike and Sarah, decided to spend the night in Old Man Miller's supposedly haunted cornfield. The stories had been circulating for years. People claimed to hear whispers in the corn, see shadowy figures darting between the rows. Some even said Old Man Miller himself still roamed the field, angry at trespassers even years after his death. We laughed it off, of course. Ghost stories were for kids, and we were practically adults now. What better way to prove it than by camping out in the spookiest place in town? As we hiked through the cornfield, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. The cornstalks towered over us, creating a maze that seemed to stretch on forever. "You sure you know where we're going, Jake?" I called out, swatting away a mosquito. He turned back, grinning. "Relax, Alex. I scoped this place out last week. There's a clearing about halfway through. Perfect spot to set up camp." I nodded, trying to shake off my nerves. It was just a field, after all. Nothing to be afraid of. We reached the clearing just as twilight was setting in. It was a small area, maybe 20 feet across, where the corn had been flattened in a rough circle. "Weird," Sarah muttered, looking around. "Wonder what caused this?" Mike shrugged, already unpacking his tent. "Probably just the wind. Come on, let's get set up before it gets too dark." We busied ourselves with pitching tents and unrolling sleeping bags. As night fell, we gathered around a small campfire, roasting marshmallows and trading ghost stories. Okay, I've got one," Lily said, her face eerily lit by the flickering flames. "They say Old Man Miller didn't just die in this field. He was murdered." Jake rolled his eyes. "Babe, everyone knows he had a heart attack while working." Lily shook her head. "That's just the official story. I heard he caught some kids trespassing, chased them with his shotgun, but they turned the tables on him, beat him to death with his own gun. A chill ran down my spine, and I wasn't sure if it was from the story or the night air." "That's bullshit," Mike scoffed. "If that was true, those kids would be in jail, unless they were never caught," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the clearing, causing the fire to sputter and the corn around us to rustle ominously. We all jumped, then laughed nervously at our own skittishness. "All right, enough ghost stories," I said, standing up. "I'm going to take a leak before bed." I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards the edge of the clearing. As I was about to step into the corn, I heard Jake call out, "Hey, Alex, I dare you to go all the way to the edge of the field and back, alone?" I turned, raising an eyebrow. "Seriously? What are we, 12? He grinned. "What's the matter, chicken? Scared of a little corn?" I knew he was baiting me, but I couldn't back down, not in front of everyone. "Fine," I sighed. "But when I get back, you owe me a beer." Clicking on my flashlight, I plunged into the corn. The stalks closed in around me immediately, blocking out the light from our campfire. All I could hear was the crunch of my footsteps and the soft rustle of leaves. I walked for what felt like ages, the beam of my flashlight barely penetrating the thick wall of corn ahead of me. Just as I was about to turn back, convinced I must have reached the edge by now, I heard something, a whisper. So faint I almost missed it. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, a soft, indistinct murmuring like someone talking just out of earshot. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" The whispering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. Then from somewhere to my left came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving through the corn towards me. Panic seized me. I turned and ran, no longer caring about the dare or my pride. I just needed to get back to the others. Corn whipped at my face as I sprinted, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps behind me quickened, matching my pace. I burst into the clearing, nearly tripping over the fire pit in my haste. My friends looked up, startled by my sudden appearance. "Alex, what's wrong?" Sarah asked, concern etched on her face. I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How could I tell them what I'd heard without sounding crazy? Before I could gather my thoughts, a scream pierced the night. We all whirled towards the sound. It had come from the corn in the direction I'd just run from. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered, his face pale. "Probably just an animal," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. We huddled closer together, eyes scanning the dark wall of corn surrounding us. The fire, which had seemed so cheerful earlier, now cast menacing shadows that danced and flickered at the edge of the clearing. Another scream, closer this time. It sounded almost human. "We need to get out of here," Lily said, her voice trembling. Now, no one argued. We scrambled to gather our things, abandoning the tents in our haste. As we were about to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. "Guys," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Where's Sarah?" We looked around frantically, but she was nowhere to be seen. "She was just here a minute ago," Mike said, panic creeping into his voice. A rustling sound came from the corn to our right. We all turned, flashlights trained on the spot. The corn stalks parted, and Sarah stumbled into the clearing. But something was wrong. She moved stiffly, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Sarah," Lily called out hesitantly. "Are you okay?" Sarah's head snapped towards us, and a smile spread across her face. But it wasn't Sarah's smile. It was too wide, stretching from ear to ear in a way that shouldn't have been possible. When she spoke, it wasn't her voice. It was deep, gravelly, and ancient. "Sarah's not here right now," it said, "but don't worry. You'll all be joining her soon." We ran. Blind panic drove us as we crashed through the corn, no longer caring about direction. All that mattered was getting away from whatever was wearing Sarah's skin. I could hear it behind us, moving through the corn with inhuman speed. Laughter echoed through the field, bouncing off the stalks until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. We broke free of the cornfield, stumbling onto the road. Our cars were parked a little way down, and we sprinted towards them. As I fumbled with my keys, I glanced back at the field. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. Figures stood at the edge of the corn, dozens of them. Some looked like Sarah, others like Old Man Miller, but most were something else. Twisted, wrong shapes that hurt to look at directly. We peeled out of there, tires screeching on the asphalt. No one spoke as we drove, our minds struggling to process what we'd seen. The next day we reported Sarah missing. Search parties combed the cornfield but found nothing. No trace of Sarah, no sign of our abandoned camping gear. It was as if that clearing had never existed. Weeks passed. Sarah's disappearance was ruled a runaway case. Her parents moved away, unable to bear the constant reminders of their lost daughter. We never spoke about what happened that night. How could we? Who would believe us? But sometimes when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear whispers carried on the breeze. And at night, I dream of endless rows of corn and something ancient and hungry moving among the stalks. I don't go near cornfields anymore, and neither should you, because you never know what might be waiting, watching in the dark spaces between the rows. Some dares are better left untaken, and some stories are better left untold. But if you do find yourself in a cornfield at night, and you hear a whisper on the wind, run. Run, and don't look back, because once it has your name, it never lets go. The Harvest of Bones. I've worked the fields my whole life, but nothing could have prepared me for what we found that autumn day. The corn was high, the air was crisp, and death rode with us on the combine. Some harvests yield more than just grain, and some secrets are better left buried in the earth. The morning started like any other harvest day. I woke before dawn, the familiar ache in my bones a reminder of decades spent working this land. The farm had been in my family for generations, passed down from father to son. Now it was my turn to bring in the crop that would see us through another year. I climbed into the cab of the combine, the machine humming to life beneath me. The first rays of sunlight were just starting to peek over the horizon as I guided the massive harvester into the cornfield. Row after row of golden stalks fell before the cutting header, disappearing into the machine's maw. It was mindless work in a way, the kind that lets your thoughts wander. I found myself thinking about my son, away at college now. Would he come back to take over the farm someday? Or would this legacy end with me? I was so lost in thought that at first I didn't notice anything amiss. It was the smell that pulled me back to the present, a sickly sweet odor cutting through the usual scents of earth and diesel. I frowned, peering at the monitors in the cab. Everything looked normal, but something felt off. The corn continued to feed smoothly into the machine, but there was a new sound mixed in with the usual clatter and whir, a dull thudding like something hard hitting the cylinder. Concerned about potential damage to the equipment, I shut down the combine and climbed out to investigate. The morning air was cool on my face as I made my way to the back of the machine, where the grain tank was slowly filling. What I saw there stopped me cold. Mixed in with the golden kernels of corn were fragments of white. At first I thought it might be pieces of stalk that had somehow made it through the threshing process, but as I leaned in for a closer look, my stomach turned. They were bones, human bones, splintered and broken by the combine's mechanisms. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a mistake, a trick of the light. But even as I tried to deny what I was seeing, I knew it was real. With shaking hands, I pulled out my cell phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice seemed to come from very far away as I explained what I'd found. She assured me that help was on the way, but warned me not to touch anything further. I stood there rooted to the spot as I waited for the police to arrive. The corn rustled softly in the breeze, as if whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. How long had these bones been here, hidden among the stalks? And more importantly, how did they get there? The sound of sirens cut through my thoughts. Soon, the edge of the field was a flurry of activity. Police cars, an ambulance, even the county coroner. I answered their questions as best I could, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. As the initial shock wore off, a horrible thought struck me. If there were bones in the grain tank, how many more had already passed through the combine? How much of the field had I already harvested? I shared my concerns with the detective in charge, a grim-faced woman named Martinez. She nodded, her expression grave. "We're going to need to search the entire field," she said. "And I'm afraid your harvest will have to be put on hold, Mr. Johnson. This is now a crime scene." The next few days were a blur. The police set up a command post at the edge of my property. Forensics teams combed through the harvested corn, sifting for more remains, and out in the field, officers walked the rows, looking for any disturbances that might indicate a burial site. Word spread quickly in our small farming community. Neighbors drove by slowly, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the activity. Reporters from the local news station set up camp at the end of my driveway, hungry for any scrap of information. I couldn't escape the whispers, the sidelong glances. I knew what they were thinking. How could I not have known? It was my land, after all. But the truth was, I was as baffled as anyone. On the third day, Detective Martinez asked to speak with me privately. We sat at my kitchen table, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. "We've identified at least 3 distinct sets of remains," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "All female, all young. Preliminary estimates suggest they've been there for several years." I felt the blood drain from my face. Years? But how is that possible? We work this field every season. Martinez leaned forward, her eyes searching mine. "Mr. Johnson, I have to ask, is there anyone who might have had access to your land? Anyone who might have held a grudge against your family?" I shook my head, my mind racing. "No, I can't think of anyone. We've always been on good terms with our neighbors, and it's just been me working the farm since my wife passed and my son left for college." She nodded, jotting something in her notebook. "And before that, any farmhands, temporary workers?" A memory stirred, hazy and half forgotten. "Well, there was one fellow about 5 or 6 years back. Drifter type, said his name was Eddie. Worked a season for us, then moved on." Martinez's pen paused. "Do you remember his last name? Any identifying details?" I closed my eyes, trying to conjure up a clearer image. Tall guy, kind of wiry. Had a tattoo on his forearm, some kind of bird. Eagle, maybe? But I'm sorry, I can't recall his last name. She wrote furiously, then looked up at me. "Mr. Johnson, I know this is difficult, but I need you to think hard. Did you notice anything unusual about this Eddie? Any strange behavior, odd hours?" I started to shake my head, then stopped. "Well, there was one thing. It seemed like he was always hanging around the old storm cellar. Said he liked the quiet down there. Used it as a sort of living quarters. We didn't mind. It was far from the house and not like we were using it." Martinez's expression sharpened. "Storm cellar? Where exactly is this?" My blood ran cold as I realized what she was thinking. It's out in the field. About a quarter mile from where we found the bones." She was on her feet in an instant, barking orders into her radio. I followed her out of the house, my legs feeling like lead. The next few hours were a nightmare. Floodlights were set up around the old storm cellar as forensics teams swarmed the area. I stood at the edge of the commotion, watching as they carried bag after bag of evidence out of that dark hole in the ground. As night fell, Martinez approached me again. Her face was drawn, her eyes haunted by what she'd seen. "Mr. Johnson," she said softly, "I won't sugarcoat this. What we found down there, it's bad, very bad. We're dealing with a serial killer, one who operated right under your nose for months. I felt like I was going to be sick, but I had no idea. How could I not have known?" She placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch surprisingly gentle. "Predators like this, they're experts at blending in, at seeming normal. You couldn't have known." But as I looked out over my field, now crawling with police and lit by harsh floodlights, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have. This was my land, my responsibility, and for years it had been hiding monstrous secrets. The harvest was a total loss that year. Between the investigation and the media frenzy, not a single ear of corn was brought in. But that was the least of my worries. The families of the victims sued, of course. I didn't fight it. How could I? Their daughters had died on my land, buried in the very soil I tended. In the end, I lost the farm, but compared to what those families lost, it seemed a small price to pay. I still dream about it sometimes. The endless rows of corn, hiding their grisly secrets. The sound of bones rattling through the combine. And always, always, the feeling that I should have known, should have seen, should have stopped it somehow. They never did catch Eddie, or whatever his real name was. Sometimes I imagine him out there somewhere, working another farm, burying more victims in another quiet field. And I wonder how many other farmers are out there right now, unaware of the horrors growing alongside their crops. So the next time you drive past a cornfield, all green and gold and peaceful, remember this: not all harvests yield grain, and some secrets, once unearthed, can never be buried again.